Welcome to another episode of the Touring Rabbit Holes podcast. This is a pretty exciting episode. This podcast was founded, of course, from people who are very, very passionate about talking about mathematics and science, and we would always talk at work about math and science, and we eventually thought we should do a podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Gabriel Hesch, and this is also your host, Alex Alanese. And this episode... In this particular episode, we will be interviewing a former high school science teacher who has taught physics and has done a lot more things than just that. Now, let me explain why we are interviewing a teacher on this episode. I'm very fascinated by what makes somebody passionate about any given topic. Whenever you see somebody who's passionate, it's very easy to tell because they can talk, at length about these topics. And obviously, in our case, it's math and science. And many, many times I've asked people what got them passionate about science, and more often than not, they will often talk about a specific teacher. So that makes me curious, well, what exactly happened that got you passionate? And in this episode, and in episodes like this, we will be interviewing nominated teachers. For this particular episode, we will be interviewing a teacher by the name of Kevin Gant, who was nominated by my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law works in STEM. He has both his bachelor's and his master's degree in physics from the University of New Mexico. He currently works at the Nuclear Weapons Complex, and he without any hesitation at all, said, "You totally should interview my old physics teacher." And he gave me an entire list of questions, which I think are really, really cool. The questions talk about things like really cool demonstrations and, making a lot of messes in the name of science. It also talks about the challenges of science education in a very, very poor state and in a state that typically performs very poorly. So I'm pretty excited. Thank you, Mr. Gaunt, for joining us today. We're very happy to have you here.
Thanks very much for having me. By the way, you can pronounce my last name Gant.
Gant, okay.
Either way is fine, but I pronounce it Gant.
Cool. I also want to say for any viewers, if you have a teacher that you would like us to interview, send us an email at touringrabbitholespodcast@gmail.com and let us know why, because we certainly love having teachers on this show. Alrighty, so now the student who nominated you sent us an entire list of questions, and I'm going to go ahead and read one of them, if that's all right. Okay, here. I actually have my fun little intro here. Let me go ahead and zoom down. So I'm going to go and read it directly from my brother-in-law's question, Greg Sanchez. He wrote, "When I was in school, Mr. Gant was known for crazy experiments. For example, dropping watermelons off the gym roof, shooting water balloons across campus with giant slingshots, and other things that actually made learning physics fun. My question is, what is the most outrageous method of teaching you have used, and has anything ever gone really wrong?" And there's more, but I'll read that later.
Has anything gone really wrong? Yeah, I'm going to have to kind of go in the data banks for that. But Greg activates a couple of different things. We spent some time talking about, basically what would be fun and what would be cool and how could we relate that to physics. So both of those things happened. One of the classic labs that I would have students do is I'd have them figure out how to find the instantaneous velocity of a bicycle in the parking lot, and they couldn't use any kind of motion detector. They couldn't use any kind of radar detector. So they had to figure out what they needed to do. And eventually they landed on this idea of a whole lot of people with stopwatches evenly dispersed along a line and having a person ride the bike down the fairway with everyone stopping their stopwatch as the bike passed them. So we created a position versus time graph, and that was certainly fun, and it got the kids out of the classroom, which we all loved, right? We live in New Mexico, so get in the beautiful sun when you can, especially in the beautiful fall.
That's really cool. So it's basically setting them up to think about calculus without even realizing it. So
Yeah. Wow. So, and what's really interesting, it's funny that you mentioned that because that's exactly what we did. Some of the work that we did actually set them up for doing calculus. So I showed typically what I would have the cyclists do is do a constant speed up the entire time. So I'd make them start in a really high gear. So per force, they had to start really slowly, right? Because when you're in that big gear, you're kind of pushing those pedals through. And as you get faster, they're easier to push and you speed up consistently.
Wow.
We also tended to do it on a bit of a down slope. So there was also some speed up. So if you take a look at a position versus time graph, of course, it's going to show a nice concave upward graph. And so when we started talking about finding the instantaneous velocity, of course, they had to create a best fit line, draw a tangent for it, find the slope of the tangent. And so when they came into my class after they'd done some calculus and they were like, hey, we just learned that that's the first derivative, da, 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 da. And they were super excited about it. Me and the calculus teacher were like, yes. So
that's so cool.
Yeah, it was a good time. But that wasn't the craziest thing I did. By far, the craziest thing we did was, well, I don't know about by far, but we decided to find the coefficient of kinetic friction between skin and wet plastic.
Wow.
With a slip and slide.
Nice.
In front of the school. So basically right in front of the principal's office, there was some grass and we laid out the slip and slide and had it. And the calculus teacher came out, and that's one of my most famous and favorite videos is watching kids slip and slide across that. And literally we were able to then superimpose that on some video analysis software that allowed us to find the speed of the person. Of course, they're slowing down as they go along. And so you can imagine that you've got a downward slope and a kind of a downward facing, or what would you say, concave downward slope, right?
Yeah.
And so using that, you could find out the coefficient of friction, which was super cool too.
That's so cool. That is so cool. An excuse to have fun while you're learning. I mean, that's really, really cool. I think, but that was very, very effective.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, I had someone ask me this question recently, and they were like, "What's the best advice you ever got as a teacher?" Mm-hmm. And the best advice I ever got from the teacher, and I'm going to call out my friend, and then I'm going to share this podcast with him. So his name is Eddie Gilmartin, mm-hmm. And Eddie and I both taught at the same time in New Orleans, Louisiana. Mm-hmm. And we were both doing Teach for America at the time. And we parted ways after a while, and we've come back and chatted with each other over the years. And after he had finished his work there, one of the things that he said was, I think the most important part of a teacher is whatever they do in class, make the lesson entertaining to them, like to yourself as a teacher. Because if you're bored, imagine what the students are feeling like.
Oh yeah. Totally.
Right. Totally. And that's been like most of the time when I was thinking about physics stuff, I'm like, what would be fun to do? And mm-hmm. that really drove an awful lot of my lesson and unit design.
Nice.
So my daughter took 2 years of high school physics and calculus, much like you talked about. And I myself taught at University of New Mexico, Los Alamos campus. And every time I was going to give a lesson, particularly to the freshmen who just finished high school and they were first year college students, is spend 10 minutes, say, discussing the topics and how they have branched out and how they touch the economy and how they touch your everyday life, how you accelerometers in your car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just try to make contact with economy, with practical stuff, and also with some history.
Yeah, for sure. The accelerometers thing I think is super interesting, right? I mean, most Americans have accelerometers in their pockets right now. Mm-hmm. Yes. So because they're in their cell phones. And so if you take a look at that, it's really super cool that, my kids knew what accelerometers were long ago. And so I wonder if how many of them actually realize that they're oftentimes in phones.
That's a good question.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so far we got real world examples where it involves slip and slides or things like slingshots or watermelons. And then other connections like technology and history. All the above sound pretty awesome. We've interviewed a lot of educators on our show. Not all teachers. One guy wrote a book called Mathematics with Bad Drawings, as well as a sequel to it in which he completely outlined all of calculus, but with comics and pictures. And everybody has always said that they believe that calculus and physics always need to be linked together. Like, that's a very, very common thing. So to hear that you worked with a calculus teacher, that lines up exactly with what everyone else has said on this topic. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool, actually. So, yeah. Anyways, unless there's any other cool demonstrations that you'd like to talk about, we can move on to the next one. Okay, very good. Let's see the next guy here. Alrighty, so he then asks some general questions about teaching passion. He says, like, what got you interested in education? Where did the passion for teaching come from? There's also a few others here. What was your favorite class to teach, and why was it the 2000 and 2001 AP Physics class, which was his class?
I can't believe that was 2000, 2001.
I know, a ways back, huh? About 20 years ago.
And it's 2020 now.
Yeah,
it's just fantastic. Well, good on you, Greg. So, so I can address some of that. The first question was what got me interested in teaching?
Yes.
Yeah. So, my thinking in high school was that I was going to be an astronaut, and I applied for the Air Force Academy, and got a nomination, but did not get an appointment. And so I ended up going to Arizona State my first year and was in line to do aerospace engineering. And so was taking all the calculus and physics and that sort of thing. Really loved the physics, obviously, and kind of came to a point, this was in 1986, 1987-ish. And so I just came to a point, though, that the world of engineering was not appealing to me.
Okay.
And, I just kind of had a little bit of a push in a different direction. And so as I considered all the possibilities, the idea of teaching occurred to me my freshman year, and it was literally like a calling. It was kind of like, holy heck, why wasn't I thinking of this before? And the moment it dawned on me that I could be a teacher, many other things that I'd done in my life really lined up. I'd spent many summers as a camp counselor. I'd done work as a lifeguard. I'd done an awful lot of care for other people. I loved engaging and chatting with people about things and explaining stuff. So the world of teaching kind of opened up to me just with a small realization my freshman year. And then after that, there was no going back. I ended up getting my degree just in physics because I didn't want I was wanting to make sure that if I was going to teach physics or math, I was going to do it well. So I figured I needed to know the material well. And so I didn't get a degree in education. I got a degree in physics.
Cool. I've actually heard a lot of folks do it that way. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, but no. And so that's that got me started. And it turns out that I had a couple of stops and starts in the world, but ended up starting teaching at Delorty in 1995. And so I actually taught Greg's older brother, Vince, before I taught Greg.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I also had Magdalena in class at some point too.
Oh, yeah. She's fun to talk to about physics. She's a natural, I think. She's brilliant. She actually went off and got her degree in mathematics. So their entire family, this is my in-laws. I married Vanessa. I don't know if you ever had Vanessa. I think she went to Cibola, actually. But the entire family is very mathematical. In fact, my wife's dad also got his bachelor's and master's in physics, and he actually met Richard Feynman. So that's a pretty cool claim to fame.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yes.
What a great experience that must have been.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Now, what's interesting is, so there's a couple of questions that were sent in from Greg that I think are really good questions. When I first wanted to interview teachers, I wanted to talk about some of the real challenges of education. Now, there is an entire there's a whole ton of challenges in education. In fact, on this podcast, we've even talked about challenges as well. One of the things that Greg's dad shared with me is, well, let's see, actually, this isn't so much a physics thing. He graduated with a master's in physics, and he actually felt frustrated with how unprepared for the world he was. He says, yeah, I can do all these calculations, but I don't know where I fit in with engineers and computer scientists who leave school, and they've got this solid set of tools where they can apply to it. He said that, as a physicist, he felt like all he can do, he felt bothered by how unprepared he was. I experienced that a little bit when I was at New Mexico Tech. They very often encouraged physicists to also get a degree in computer science as well. And this is a tough question to answer. I don't know if you'll have an answer for it, but do you feel that that's kind of where physics education has gone, like pure physics? Like it's if you get a degree in it, it's less applicable than other things?
You ask a very, very complex question.
Right? Yeah, I do.
So the underpinnings of your question are predicated upon the notion that any kind of education that we have should have applicability, right?
That's true. Yes.
And so in a transactional approach to education, that's true.
Yes.
In a more philosophical approach to education, maybe not so, right?
Yeah.
People end up getting a degree, for instance, in 17th century Irish philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And there might not be a ton that you can do with that. There might not be tools that you have for that, but you're a much richer person for having engaged in thinking about great thoughts that were influenced by some other folks. So I think that education is a tricky business, and it's very easy for us to fall into that world of thinking of it as the transactional sort of affair, when in fact, in many cases, I think education is meant for enrichment, and oftentimes enrichment of an individual, not necessarily for job training.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it totally does. And actually, in fairness, so that was kind of a spur of the moment question. I just know that I faced that before. And again, that's definitely a life, that's a very deep question, depending on what one wants out of physics, So
I never felt like I didn't have tools when I finished my bachelor's or my master's. Actually, my master's was in mathematics and then my PhD's in physics. I felt like I was able to jump into the engineering world. I did a postdoc in medical physics with high-intensity focused ultrasound on cancer, and was able to jump in and use first principles, and I was able to transfer to an accelerator project, and I just felt I had fungible tools.
Yeah, I hear you. I think, and that's really encouraging to hear. I think also part of this, and again, it may be more of a cynical outlook, it depends on what somebody is expecting, and it could be that, somebody just is frustrated until they find their fit. I will say that everybody who's said that I've talked to specifically has, found something like I've got a friend who got a degree in mathematical physics, and he now works at an antennas lab and is very, very happy. Mm-hmm. But I do remember at the time, and he hadn't settled on it. You know what I mean? Like he hadn't really settled on his particular calling. So it could be that the sentiment is more or less just, not knowing exactly what you're going to do and the anxiety that comes with that. So, I think that's probably fair as well.
The world of physics is tricky, right?
Yeah.
I love Alex's point of applying first principles. And I think that that's oftentimes the way physicists look at things. So physicists are oftentimes hired for jobs that don't sound like physics, but they're very much in line with the kind of thinking that's involved in physics, because physicists always go to first principles.
Yeah.
Because that's, there's the fantastic phrase, imagine a spherical cow.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You oftentimes become really good at reducing a system into its most fundamental pieces and think about the interaction between those pieces in order to understand the system as a whole. Mm-hmm. And so physicists, I think, are well poised for that. And there are an awful lot of things that you can do where you can apply first principles and that mode of thinking to the system that you've got in front of you.
Yeah.
So I think as an educator in physics, I think that's one of the things you're giving students, and what students take from physics training, is make a problem no more complicated than it needs to be. Get to the absolute essential features of it.
Yeah, I hear you. So yeah. Now,
and yet we talk about the immutability between physics and and calculus. Oh, thanks. Speaking of smart people, my brother just walked in. He's the smart person in the family.
Oh.
So he works at Sandia Labs and does coding for them. So that's he's understanding everything I said based upon like the freshman year of physics that he had at Caltech.
Nice. Very cool. I like the mug. I certainly.
Oh, sorry.
That's awesome.
You gave me this mug.
Oh, like to hold in front of the camera?
Yeah. So that's pretty awesome.
I can get you a drink.
So, again, there's this thread here of difficult questions here. Greg was also talking about, we live in New Mexico, which I think both in terms of the poverty rate as well as various assessments. I know that we rank pretty low in the United States, just overall based on certain assessments. Greg was wondering what you think about the challenges with education in New Mexico and what can be done to mitigate that, realizing that it's a very tricky question because, again, it's just based on certain assessments. But
that's a very hard question to answer,
Yeah.
What a diverse state, right?
Yes.
I taught Greg at Del Norte High School, which was a fancy school in 1962. And then it was understood to be a ghetto school in 1990. And then it was, at this point, I think it's somewhere middle of the road. Meanwhile, we live in a state that has half of its people living in a rural environment and may not have access to very good teachers starting from the get-go. And when you're talking about physics, you're talking about students who need to come and enter into a high school course, depending upon the level of interaction and difficulty you want to make the course, to what extent you want to make it transparent with calculus, for instance. They need to come in with an awful lot of math that they might not have had previously. So living in a poor state has some real tangible difficulties that are associated with it. Alex, being in Los Alamos, has one of the highest per capita income rates in America, for heaven's sake. And they have marvelous education. And then you go to some place like Thoreau, and there may not even be a physics class there, right? So, the difficulty that we face in New Mexico oftentimes is just a function of what it means to live in a poor and rural state, and what are the resources allocated to people who live farthest from the civilization centers, right?
You're absolutely correct, and that's one of the things we talked about, a wealth gradient effect, so to speak. And I had a spouse of one of my coworkers at Los Alamos. She was a teacher at Powake, which is just down the hill. From
just down
Los
the road,
Alamos.
yeah.
And she had to buy books and supplies because the school district couldn't afford to buy supplies, and there were no PCs, et cetera. And this was just about 10 years ago. Wow. So there's just an incredible wealth gradient. And
yeah, I hear you. I feel that.
No. Okay. And that's something we talked about in a previous podcast. My daughter had so many more advantages than, say, someone from a different part of Albuquerque. And I don't really know how to do outreach other than through what Gabriel's doing, podcasting, outreach to teachers, and just working at it.
And here's the thing. As I'm going through this list, I always try to ask fair questions. I know from statistics that you can talk about anything and make anything sound, abysmal or awesome based on how you frame it. And I'm generally a very optimistic person. And there's so many ways to look at a given situation that it's hard to, say New Mexico, as a whole, is one of the poorest, but that doesn't mean that you can't have fantastic education, you know what I mean? Or have a class full of people who have less exposure to certain things, so they're maybe less behind in certain areas, but that doesn't mean you can't have very meaningful education. And I think for that reason, I personally, if I were to answer that question, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to numbers. You do the best that you can do, and that's the best you can do. Otherwise, what are you gonna do? And also, one other part of my answer to that question, we have a lot of opportunity right now. For example, this podcast on YouTube. There are some phenomenal resources on YouTube itself. I don't know if you're familiar with the show 3 Blue, 1 Brown. It's a YouTube show done by a mathematician from, I think it was Stanford, but I don't quote me on that. And he pulled together Python. He pulled together a couple of visual libraries, and he put together the most magnificent program that demonstrates graphics for linear algebra and other branches of mathematics. And he's got, I think he has over 3 million followers on his YouTube now. And I know things about linear algebra that I never ever would have known, simply because he put them up there, and I am, I was there to see it. So I don't know. There's a lot of opportunity now for education, even for people in rural places. So yeah, it's exciting to be doing a podcast and being part of that. So I know that's kind of a vague answer for that, but all right, let's see some other questions. Okay. Greg also had a question about reconnecting with former students, and I'm going to go ahead and read exactly what he wrote. He says, you now have former students all over the world doing some pretty amazing things. In my own life, your class provided the main inspiration for my decision to study physics or any of the sciences. Do you keep up with any of your other students and what they're doing? Do you have any students who you are particularly proud of? How does it feel to know that your enthusiasm as a teacher has led to those things happening?
Yeah. Well, pride is tricky business, isn't it? Right?
Yes,
because
yes.
you want to take pride in something, but it's really the student who did the work. So I do have many students, though, that have done some marvelous work, and Greg would top the list for sure. I mean, every time that as a physics teacher, you have a kid major in physics, you're ebullient. And I certainly was when I found that out from Greg, and have had some great conversations with Greg about that. I've got another student, and Greg knows her. Her name is Hesperigo, and she went to Caltech and then subsequently made to University of California in San Francisco, doing some work around some biophysics, and she is now a biophysics professor at Yale.
Awesome.
And is kicking butt, right? So she's got her own lab. So she's not so much doing teaching as she's doing research around biophysics. And it's really interesting work where they're actually getting visible microscopy increased by a level of 10 as a result of casting light on things and using the diffraction pattern that comes off of it to discern what the object is. So, God, I hope I got that right, Hesper, as you're listening to this. So, but just because someone majors in physics or doesn't major in physics doesn't mean I love them any less or more, or am more proud or less proud of them.
Totally.
So there's a student with whom I have great conversations with and go mountain biking with occasionally, Mike Muscato. He works for, cell phone company, and he does an awful lot of programming around that sort of thing. And he's utterly fantastic. He was one of my earliest students. He walked into the first test without having done the pre-test. He said, "Mr. Gant, I've got this."
Nice.
Okay, fine. And he did really well on the test. So he was well appointed. Another one who lives in town, Nate Huff, who was a basketball star. He was probably 6'4". Everyone knew him about basketball. I thought he was great at basketball, but I noticed that here was this amazing kid who did really well in physics, and I pushed him towards the world of math and science. He's now a surgeon and doing marvelously well. And he's just a great show of doing wonderful work. So yeah, I mean, I do keep up with students. Another one of my students is now a teacher, and he's an English teacher, and I couldn't be more proud. So he teaches at one of the high schools, Rio Bravo. I forgot the name of the school, but we chat about teaching on a regular basis. In fact, I just texted with him just the other day. So I will say that Facebook has been, as problematic as Facebook has been recently in the world, nonetheless, it has allowed me
to be out there, and students tend to reach out and say, ask to be my friend, and I always say yes, almost always. And it's fantastic to hear their stories, for sure.
Very cool. Very cool. Nice. During our email exchanges, one of the things you had talked about is how right now you are no longer teaching in a classroom, but you are doing other things that are definitely related to education. Can you tell us a little bit about what you are currently doing?
Sure. So I work for New Tech Network, which is a nonprofit organization based out of California. And my association with it was based upon the fact that in 2001, we moved from Albuquerque to Napa, California to try the school out. And the school was committed to all project-based learning. And I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. I was about 5-6 years into my career and thought that this was a time to try something new. So went off and did project-based learning there, taught with a person. And interestingly enough, we taught in a parallel manner. So we had a double-sized classroom and 2 teachers. It was both physics and algebra 2. And those 2 were combined, which works really well for a semester, it turns out. And so once we got that going, really enjoyed that. But by the end, really by the end of the first year, my wife and child and I decided that while Napa was lovely, it had committed the crime of not being our home. Mm-hmm. So we ended up moving back to New Mexico. So a lot of people are mystified by that, but it was a no-brainer for us. So out of that school, though, that school got an awful lot of attention from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave them a $10 million grant twice to replicate the school. Out of that was born a nonprofit called the New Tech Network, and that's for whom I work. And I joined them later on in around 2007 and started helping teachers understand what it means to do project-based learning. And so I did an awful lot of coaching around project-based learning, and now I'm working on something a little different, and that is that projects typically are for a unit, for multiple week affairs, but lesson plans are really interesting. So I've been working with teachers in developing ways that teachers can teach in a way that really focuses the work on the student and what we call student-centered. And it's really simple. It's like you create a structure that allows the students to talk more than the teacher in the class period. And when you have the right prompts, when you have the right questions, when you have the right setup, when you have the right lab and all that sort of thing, a student-centered classroom can do wonders for the kiddos. And so that's a lot of the work that I'm doing. I do an awful lot of training of teachers and helping them kind of reformulate the way that they look at the classroom.
Okay, wow, very cool, very cool. That term was actually used very, very often when I taught at some charter schools. The schools that I taught at didn't quite. They are no longer around just because they do come and go. Pretty often, I'd say. But in theory, we were supposed to do almost all project-based learning. So that's certainly a common term I've heard in the last 5 years or so. So no, 10 years. Oh goodness, it's been. I forgot how long it's been. Wow, goodness. So.
And I started learning about it in 2001. So that was 19 years ago. Yes. So.
Now here's what I don't quite understand, and I think it's because with the school that I was at, it was still kind of it didn't quite gel. What you did, from Greg's questions about your projects with the slip and slide and with the other things, with watermelons or slingshots, that sounds very, very, very much like a project. How would what you've learned about project-based learning differ from that, or were you already doing it?
Good question. So projects can be short or long, right?
Yes.
And so if you go outside and you shoot a slingshot for a class period, maybe 50 minutes, and you talk about the acceleration of the object while it's in the air, which was what we did on day 1 in the class, that's a short business, right? That's not an in-depth kind of exploration. But if you ask students to, through a series of pulleys, lift up an engine in your class, then that might actually take a little bit more terms of experimentation and understanding of forces and multiplication of forces and getting into work, for you to really think about something. So when you start to talk about like dropping watermelons off of a roof, or launching water balloons with a slingshot, those are moments in time, right?
Mhm.
And those can be part of a project that oftentimes goes to a more complex question or a more complex approach, right?
Yes.
You speak to a particle physicist and you say, hey, we want to get this, these particles, these electrons up to 4 nines, right? Which is to say 99.99% of the speed of light. And then suddenly that's
Yes.
a very large experiment. That's a very large project, right?
Yes.
Particularly when you start talking about all of the necessary items for the instruments that need to read off the results of an explosion when a particle runs into another particle. So depending upon the nature of the task, you might have some of those activities that you described at the beginning as part of the project, but the project will typically last a little longer.
So I actually have thought of a project. I don't know if it's appropriate at the high school level, but if you have calculus training, say your second year high school, and you now have some calculus behind you, I always thought, and I am a particle physicist, is the connection of diffusion, which was done by a biologist, right, Brown, with pollen particles in a cup and watching them move around. And Einstein used that to prove, by God, underneath that, there have to be some things about the size and weight and behavior of atoms that statistical physics had thought of. So we're going from a cup of water and diffusing pollen particles just bouncing around to the proof of the existence of atoms. And then right after I finished my PhD, I ended up working for an energy company, modeling stochastic partial differential equations, which is nothing more than little particles bouncing around in water. And you can simulate that with Excel, where the price might go up or down stochastically and it drifts up, and you have an expected price in the future and you have a standard deviation. And oh, by the way, that connects to the fact that it takes thousands of years for light particles to escape from the sun. And if you have a smelly event in an elevator, how long it takes for someone else to detect that. And there's just so much connectivity to diffusive processes, and with Excel and some YouTube videos and a cup of water. And those are like, would you imagine that to be a month?
Yeah, that sounds like the perfect, I mean, if I were consulting with you right now as a teacher,
Right.
I'd say, absolutely. Let's talk about how you would pose that question to your students.
Right.
What resources you would say are available, what resources you would not so much hide, but not necessarily describe to begin with, so that they might have to ask some questions to do some research around some of the resources. But this idea of, hey, we want you to prove the existence of molecules using a cup of water and some pollen is that's like the beginning of a project right there.
Right.
That's perfect.
Cool. Awesome. So honestly, it's conversations like that originally interested me in education itself. Just, these imaginative ways of exploring complex ideas. And, I remember the reason why this podcast exists, or the reason why, it's all from these really cool ideas and figuring out ways to share that information. So one other question then. So where education is right now, how hard would it be to I guess, I don't want to say become fully project-based, because I don't know if that's practical, but I don't know. How much room is there right now to make education more project-based? Like, sorry, I'm not phrasing that very...
What is the right fraction?
There's a lot of room, but the teaching that's involved in project-based learning is more nuanced than regular teaching, right? So in project-based learning, if you're doing it super well, the students don't ask the question, what are we doing today? They come into class with a mission, right? Because they've been given a task, and now they've probably broken it up into subtasks and that sort of thing. They've got resources available to them. And part of their mission might be coming up to the teacher and saying, hey, we need some more help with differential equations. Can you do a lecture on that? Or, hey, we need to do some experimentation with this. Do we have access to the lab at this point? So being the flexible teacher to allow for something like that in a science classroom requires flexibility. And so typically the thing that prevents project-based learning from happening in the classrooms is the teacher more than anything else. Students tend to dig it. So it's the teacher thinking about how you connect the world of what you're teaching to the larger world, because that is one thing. I am a huge fan of philosophical education and thinking that education is good for refinement of self. But I'm also a big fan of application. And I do think that project-based learning is the perfect place for application. So, it can allow for that. And there are an awful lot of people, I think, Greg, that enter into the world of physics and haven't necessarily made those connections, right? We talked about that earlier to the end, and I wasn't necessarily equipped to deal with the world. But there are an awful lot of people who, through first principles, can find ways to create projects, right?
Nice.
So, but it takes more nuanced facilitation, and it takes a creative, divergent thinker to generate the ideas for the projects.
Nice. Very cool. Okay. So for any of our listeners who have heard what you just said about that, what are some resources that you can give to them, or that they could go to find out more
around project-based learning?
Sure.
Yeah. So I've got a variety of websites that I can send it to anyone about that sort of thing. So
awesome.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that with you after this meeting.
Awesome. Very good. Okay, cool. Yeah. I don't know if there's any links, then I'll just put those in the video itself.
Yeah.
So very cool. Awesome. Okay. Well, I think actually that brings us to the end. I mean, there's a few other questions here, but just in terms of pertinent to this discussion, I don't know. I think that might be it. Well, there was more of a personal question, and this one is an interesting one. Greg did ask, and I hope you're okay with me asking this. If not, we can edit, obviously.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Oh, very good. Very good. So one of the questions that Greg has asked is, has your recent health journey made you regret any part of your career decisions? And that's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question, and I'm going to have to interrogate Greg about this.
Yes.
But it's also a good question, I think.
Okay.
So, yeah. And to elaborate, I had a brain tumor. And was diagnosed 2 years ago. What's today? Today's September. Yeah, so just a month from now. I had in 2018, I had an MRI on October 16th, and then we had a conversation on October 24th that said, with a neurologist, hey, Kevin, you've got brain cancer. And so that's no small thing, as you can imagine. So the great news is that I was able to have it removed. Barrow Brain and Spine out in Phoenix did the work, and I was like super, super grateful. But living in that world, I mean, it is really interesting living in this world of having had a brain tumor. I mean, when you tell people that, they have very low expectations for you, and that's statistically merited.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just take a look at the victims, it's a rough piece. So did it make me regret any of my decisions? Yeah. I think that's such an interesting gig there. Here's what I'll say. That was the year I turned 50. My wife was brilliant. She, we had a big party. And then she made it so that 4 of my best friends, like over life, somehow made it to the party, and none of them live in New Mexico. Wow. So, and it was a big surprise and seeing all of them. And one of the questions that we were asking, the 4 of us, as we were hanging out at one point was, hey, how'd you do with your career? How'd you do in your life? Now, this was in September. This was literally basically just a month before I heard about the brain cancer. And I answered, I said, I feel like I hit it out of the park. Wow. I mean, every single day I went into the classroom teaching with kids and helping them like ask questions about the world and say, isn't that cool? And understand what a rainbow is when you look at a rainbow, and understand that the colors are just like ephemeral and could be different to every single person. And understand that you have to know what position is before you get to velocity, before you get to acceleration. And if you understand the relationship between them, your mathematical understanding of graphical world is far better. All of those things, is just like teaching was magical, and it still is.
Yeah.
So do I regret it? No, hell no.
Okay. I think knowing Greg, knowing how he talks about you, I think he knew that would be your answer, and I didn't think he meant that. Yeah. And so let me also say this as well. I have one kiddo, and how busy I am with one kiddo. Like I type something and then suddenly there's stickiness like on the floor. Where'd that come from? He has 6 kiddos. Yes.
I have a 22-year-old, but I've been through what you were through. So, yes.
So I think that when I said, hey, I'm interviewing your teacher tomorrow morning, he had to quickly come up with questions very quickly. So I think that the wording, he may have meant something. He didn't mean I think he knew that your answer would be what it was, and that's why he said it, based on my prior conversations with him. I didn't think he meant oh, do you ever wish you went off, and made it on Wall Street or something? You know what I mean? Because, I think, I'm sure he, that was the intention behind that. So
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly don't take offense at the question.
Very
So that's totally fine.
Very good.
I think it is kind of interesting, and despite some of your prevarications here, I think I am going to interrogate him.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Do it. I'll have this episode for him. So awesome. Very good. Okay. So yeah, and on this list, there's not actually any more questions on this list. I think you did a very good job of that. Do you have other questions yourself, Alex, about anything at all we've talked about?
No, I just want to say how grateful I am for people like yourself who are out there day in, day out, making physics inspirational. I mean, I know that when I taught for 8 years up at Los Alamos, that it would be a kind of high when it went well. It was as good as playing a great game of tennis or you feel high on life when you connect. And one of my students went on to get her PhD in mathematics. And I just love that diffusion of knowledge and making the world more intelligent to deal with the challenges that we're faced with. To have a more intelligent approach, more aware approach.
For sure. Oh man, you said it. So yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Cool. Awesome. Alrighty. Well, I guess that's really all I have on this end, and that's one of the ways that we usually end podcasts is we ask our guests if there's anything that they would like to plug, any websites, any books, anything at all for our viewers to consider.
Yeah, that's fun. It's funny. Okay, yeah, sure. I work for a nonprofit, and we are a business. So yeah, I'll send you the link to newtechnetwork.org.
Cool.
If you're interested in transforming your school and thinking about a school as it might be in terms of project-based learning, we are considered the Cadillac of school transformation groups. So
awesome.
It's really good work, and we help transform education.
Awesome. Very good. Cool. Very good. All right. Last thing I'll say is, so with our 2 shows, we do pretty well. If you have anybody else from your company that you would like to have on the Breaking Math podcast or the Touring Rabbit Hole show, the Breaking Math podcast is ranked number 1 in math podcast on Apple iTunes. It's got a pretty sizable audience, so it's pretty cool. This show is exciting because I've never done a YouTube show before, and I've always wanted to, and we are brand new, so we're not quite that big yet, but the intention is to grow it. So yeah, we're also just send them our way because we love to talk to folks who are passionate about education. So
right on.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Mr.
What
King.
a pleasure it was chatting with both of you and meeting you.
Pleasure to have you. All right. Take care, and we'll be in touch. All right. Thank you, sir.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.